Hello, welcome back to Playbook podcast. I'm Cade Largent. And today we're back with another episode targeting structuring your podcast. An important aspect to think about is who are you doing it with? Is it you, or are you going to have a co-host? That's something you really want to think about. And that's a really basic structure for how you want to present structured and academic, or are you going for something more lighthearted and comedic? You really want to think about the overall tone that you're trying to present with.
And it doesn't make a lot of sense to have a comical tone when you're talking about dealing with cancer, for example. You can throw in some funny things, but at the end of the day, you want to pose the right tone for the topic. And a lot of times that is got to be in alignment to make it work. So that's a super important point to make that, like, for example, this podcast, we're not super structured. We're just telling you things from our experience. And for those of you that don't know or haven't read the notes, we're a father and son team. And so there are a lot of things that you'll hear as we get more comfortable. This is our first podcast together. But as we get more comfortable, we'll probably become a little more at ease with who we are on the microphone, and because I know behind the cameras and behind the scenes, we joke around a lot and have a good time. So we want to inject as much of that as we can. But at this point, where we're still getting used to putting these podcasts together, we're probably going to be a little more stiff than we typically would be. But bear with us, because we're trying to strike the right tone for this podcast as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I feel like a lot of people want to be perfect on their first try, and I would too, but it's just not realistic. And you're gonna find your voice, you're gonna find your rhythm, if you will, as you go along, and get a real personality and a real feel for what your podcast is and what you can present it as. So
yeah, our good friend Chris Kremitzos that runs Podfest wrote a book a couple years ago called Start Ugly. And that's definitely what we're doing. We're starting ugly. It's ready, fire, aim. We just want to get this podcast out there, and we'll get better as we spend more time behind the mic and behind the cameras together. But I think it's more important to get started. But before you do that, before you do any of this, you've got to structure your podcast.
Yeah, for sure. And so something I think a lot of people, especially with clients that we've dealt with, wonder is, are we going to do a script? Do we need to like to what level are they going to plan, And so a lot of people, they don't want to have to come up with anything on the spot. They don't want to do improv. They don't want to guess. And so a lot of people sometimes want to over structure. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so case in point, today's episode, I'm looking at a skeleton of a format for today's topics. We don't have bullet points that say all the specific things we're going to talk to. But I've found that, you made a really good point, because if you overstructure, when you have a conversation with a guest, for example, you're not listening to the answer so that you can engage. You're looking at the next question and you're just trying to follow the map. And I think some of the best podcast gold you can find is when you actually take time and listen, and then can build on the conversation rather than adhere to a strict bullet point, skeleton or outline of your podcast.
For sure. I've listened to some podcasts where it's exactly what you're saying. The guest will go into some really deep, profound, thought-provoking idea, and instead of building on that and trying to pull more from it, they go, okay, and then ask a completely random question, or at least it feels random since we've gone down this avenue, and it completely throws off the whole tempo, it throws off the rhythm, and you miss out on really good content that you could have potentially cashed in on if you had just continued with that thought-provoking idea and continued, talking about what they wanted to talk about instead of just switching up.
Yeah, it sounds and really feels inauthentic if you don't take time to listen to what your guest has to say and build on that and really let that conversation go. You can at some point take a look at your outline and maybe make the weave back in. But if the content is great, I can't tell you how many podcasts that we've produced and that we've listened to. We let our guests and our clients just go. It's like, don't worry about the time. Don't worry about the if you're creating anything that's going to be different for us. We're going to do some editing. But what we can't do is we can't edit great content into your podcast. So it's better for you to just go down the rabbit hole with your guests. You should always be in control, but if there's as a podcast host, you should always be in control. But don't cut off. I mean, you said it really good. And I can think of so many examples of where they're not listening to the answer, and they just want to get their questions asked. And so that's a bad way to structure. I would, in my experience of doing this for almost 20 years now. I mean, I started in 2007, so it's not quite 20, but it's over 15. Let the conversation go where it will, and just practice the art of listening. So formatting is a great thing to have an outline, but don't lose content gold because you want to adhere so strictly to your outline. For sure.
Another thing that I think is important to consider when you're trying to structure your podcast is, how do you want to segment it up? How do you want to go from your intro into, is it the meat of it? Is it going to be an interview? Is it going to be a segment based on that week's, news or whatever your podcast is focused on? But how do you want to break it up into more digestible pieces that people can, if they have a 15-minute car ride and you have an hour-long podcast, maybe they just want 15 minutes of it. Where can they go, and what is the best way for you to present that?
Yeah, that's a great point too. And this is what's really interesting, especially if you're doing this by yourself, is you have to think, how can I get as much content from this conversation as possible? And so the things you need to think about is, what is going to be digestible for social media? How am I going to be able to create clips that are going to allow me to repurpose? And you're going to hear us use that word a lot, as repurpose, because the people that listen to your podcast probably won't read a blog that you would do. But if you take that same content and create a blog, you're going to capture a whole new audience, and people may neither listen to your podcast or read your blog, but they may live on social media. And so you have to have content, and that segmenting that you talked about is a really nice way to create content that you can not only use primarily in your podcast, but can secondarily use in all these different mediums that you need to create to be ubiquitous in the space that you're trying to educate or entertain or whatever. So you have to think about all of those elements before you start your podcast, because you want to know where those elements are going to be best suited for different needs. And we have tons of clients that use their podcasts, segment them purposely and purposefully, and then it makes us on the back end really useful to say, oh, we're going to take this 3-minute segment and we're going to make that a short video on YouTube. We're going to cut it into 3 1-minute segments for social media, and then we're going to take some quotes and put it in a blog post. So yeah, I mean, you how you structure your podcast is something that you really need to think about from a standpoint of that end user and how they're going to consume your content that you create.
Yeah, especially like going to Podfest and everything. When you tell someone you have a podcast, they'll go, "Oh, okay," and then they just kind of like, look at you. But if you have a 30-second, minute-long clip that you can show them that really sells your brand and sells, the value that you have to offer, it really makes it a lot easier for people to go, oh, this is what your podcast is about. This is what I can expect from it. And this makes me want to click on it. Because the idea of, I don't know your personality. I don't really know, what your podcast is about. It's an hour long. Do I want to make that commitment? It's going to be a lot harder to say yes if you haven't seen a smaller version of that. And so segmenting it can really be beneficial for just selling the idea of your podcast and getting people excited for it.
Yeah, and I know for myself, because like everybody else, our times are often really restrictive, but I can't tell you how many podcasts I follow just from social media. I get a 30-second snippet here, a minute and a half here, and I get the gist of what that episode's about. And if I want to go back and listen to the whole thing, then I've got reference points to use to go back and find that episode and either subscribe if I haven't already, or just go back and listen. So yeah, it's super important to create that persona of who you want to be and how your content is consumed, so that you can maximize whatever those possibilities are, because not all podcasts are created equal, and I can tell you a number of podcasts that I listen to personally that I listen because of the little snippets that I see on social media.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing I wanted to talk on is doing parts to an episode. So a lot of people will have a guest come on, and they'll get into a really good rhythm. They'll have a great conversation. It's an hour long, but your podcasts are normally 20-25 minutes. Okay, not a big deal. I would recommend, rather than having all your podcasts at 25 minutes and then this next one is going to be an hour, you can segment that by cutting it in half, finding a good stopping point within your interview, and now you have 2 podcasts. And so if you're weekly, instead of having 1 week of content, have 2 weeks of content, and people are going to want to come back because they started that interview and they want to see how it ends. What do you think about that?
Yeah, we do that all the time, and I think it's super important because one of the things we do in post-production is we try to format if it's a multi-episode interview, we try to end the episode with almost a cliffhanger, so that there's a really important question that's being asked, and then we end the episode so that people want to come back and listen to the second episode. And I think that segmenting is important for long episodes, but also to just break up if you listen to somebody talk for an hour, I don't care if it's in person, I don't care if it's on a podcast, if it's just them talking, it can get boring. Even if it's the most exciting concept you've ever heard, if it's just this monotone, kind of the same thing over and over again. So I know, I work in the healthcare world, and I have a podcast that I've decided to make like an old magazine show, which you guys are probably too young to understand, but they would break up into different segments. So, for example, in the podcast that I do, the first 3 minutes is the news for that industry. Here are the top headlines for the news from this industry. Then I have a sound bridge that is like a trivia question that when we come back from an ad, if I have an ad or if I have a affiliate link that I want to share, I do a nice bridge there, give them the answer, and then introduce the guest. And then the guest is a 20-minute or so interview, and then I try to wrap up with a summary of what that conversation was, and if it's going to be a continuation, then, and I say in part 2 is going to talk about these things, so you kind of tease them. But there's always something moving, and it's not always my voice that's being heard. And I think if you're going to, especially if you're going to do a solo podcast, that you make sure that there are a lot of segues for people to take breaks and things like that. So if they're driving, they can, that's a wonderful thing about podcasts. If you're in the car and you're listening, you can stop it at a segment and then pick it right back up. And so that makes it really helpful to the listener. And I think it's good for you to be able to have those different facets, because you can record different aspects of a podcast. And then almost like building blocks, you can take this segment that you recorded here, this segment from here, and this interview, and put those together, and you can make an entire podcast. So as you're creating your podcast, think about that from a standpoint of how can you keep the podcast moving quickly. You're not wasting any time on the niceties. Hey, I had a great day. I went fishing this weekend, or whatever that is, and just give your audience the information that they want and need, because that's why they're listening. And you can lose them as quickly as you gain them if you don't have useful, valuable information or entertainment for them to consume. For sure.
One thing I really wanted to touch on, because you and I have both experienced this, is intros and outros. Some people like to make them lengthy. Some people like to make them very short. I feel like I would be somewhere in the middle. But what do you think about intros and outros, and how to make them, punchy, recognizable, and maybe not too long?
Yeah. So we have a mutual good friend that wrote a book called Microscripts, his name's Bill Schley, and he's got a couple of New York Times bestsellers out there. One of them is called Microscripts, How to Tell Your Story in a Sentence or Less. And so I adhere to that. So if it's your podcast, it's welcome to this podcast where you're going to blah, 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 and blah, 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 and that's it. And then crank it up. Because, for two reasons. One, again, you don't want to waste people's time. But two, as you gain a following, you don't need to reintroduce yourself over and over and over again with this long, lengthy introduction. We've had people that have come in with 1.5-minute introductions, and it's just, it's awful. There's no other way to put it. We don't need an hour-and-a-half intro. Give us 5 to 10 seconds of who you are and what the overall meaning of the podcast is, and then get right into it. And I find that to be the most effective, the most useful, and the most listener-friendly way to do it. And a lot of people don't do any intros. They just jump right in. And I think that's fine, too. Once you feel like you've got an audience that knows who you are and what you're about, maybe you ditch the intro altogether.
Yeah, Joe Rogan, for example, turns on the music, they raise it up, and then they lower it back down, he starts talking, and that works for him. I think the biggest thing for intro is you want to encapsulate the vibe of your podcast, I would say, within that small time period. And so you want it to be true to what you're trying to express. And so if it's music you like and you think it goes along with the podcast, that's great. But yeah, that would be my biggest recommendation, is just making sure you're not straying too far from the actual feel of the podcast, because sometimes people just listen to the intros and go, this might not be for me. So you just want it to be very revealing of what the podcast is going to be, and give them that vibe so that they can make their decision from there.
I wholeheartedly agree with that.
Yeah. I think the last thing that we wanted to talk on is just balancing length and pacing, just making sure that, we're not going too long, we're not going too short, and we're just, keeping it interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a super important key to creating a podcast. That's one of the first questions that we get asked is, how long should our podcast be? And I'll tell you, I have spent a lot of time with people that have done really great things in the podcasting space, and And Dave Jackson, who runs a School of Podcasting, and you can check out his website at schoolofpodcasting.com. And also, who's the other person that I was going to mention? I'm losing my content right offhand, but they both said, look, as long as you're giving good content, continue speaking. When you're done giving good content, in the episode. And so, we usually try to keep ours. We're running a little long today, but for what we normally do. But I think some of the topics that we're talking about are just really important. But I think it's as long as you're creating value for your listener, keep talking. But don't try to put filler in, because people catch on to that and they know that you're just you're just killing for time. And so, and the great thing about podcasting is there are no rules about length, and there's so many myths out there about, the most popular podcasts are this long, or they do this or they do that, when it's just not true. So as long as you're creating good content, keep talking, and when you're done, end it. Simple as that.
100%. And on that note, no, I'm just playing. But but yeah, I think that's pretty much all we've got for this week. I think structuring your podcast is definitely a super important milestone, and making sure that, it's exactly what you want it to be, and it is succeeding in whatever goals you have for it. But yeah.
Well, I think we've said all we need to say, so I agree with you. It's time to wrap this one up. We hope you've enjoyed this show, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Playbook for Podcasting.